This is an interview of AOC from a few weeks ago, and it's really interesting because once you get through the sort of bourgeois millennial twaddling, you can actually see how people like her come to the conclusion that race, sex, and class are vectors of this new system of victim currency. And I need to be very careful about how I portray Cortez because she's not stupid. I think she's actually quite cunning. And she's not a bad person, but what she is a young ideologue. And she's an ideologue whose coming of age moment came through her election as a U.S. representative. And she is sharp, make no mistake about it. She is absolutely brilliant when she uses social media to rally her base. And she's actually very much like Trump. She's very vague, deflective, and again, she's really crafty. But when it comes to political science, she's just really foolish. And that's because she's not well educated in political science or really in just kind of the art of, I guess, political craftsmanship. She can't flesh out the ideas she comes up with. And that's because, like, any idea that comes through, I don't know, kind of a Marxist social justice lens, the ideas sound good, but when you dig down, they're either empty or unbelievably expensive, or they're just oppressive. I mean, socialism is just a shit ideology, but I think she is the way she is because she's young. She's been fairly average or below average in most of her endeavors until she threw out some radical talking points with, again, really excellent social media marketing and branding and won a congressional election. I mean, it really is amazing. But anyhow, listen to this interview.
The idea that you can be poor and benefit from the color of your skin does not compute for a lot of people. And going through that realization is very painful, or even just economically for people that were born with silver spoons. It's very painful to admit that you had advantages.
This is a really interesting point, and I've been saying this for a long time. This is the prime example of the left really vilifying people who are successful, like vilifying young men and women who are born into middle class or upper middle class or even wealthy families and continue doing well, and making them feel bad for that. Like making them feel like because they didn't grow up poor or they didn't grow up black or they didn't grow up female or transgender or whatever, that they really haven't had to work for anything. If you haven't struggled in your quest for success, then you don't deserve what you get. This is a really, really kind of toxic way to treat your fellow countrymen. And it is, again, interesting how she articulates this because it is very much through the lens of a Marxist, which is exactly what AOC is. I mean, she is a Marxist.
And it's just...
Look what happened to Brett Kavanaugh when he was confronted.
Oh my God! It literally is an identity meltdown. It's a fundamental.
I worked for everything I ever had.
Yeah, and like
again, this is your belief that somebody who's born into a wealthy family, or at least not born into humble beginnings, can't possibly earn their lot in life. Like Brett Kavanaugh didn't study really hard in high school, despite the fact that he might have grown up with a silver spoon in his mouth. It doesn't matter if he does everything possible to get to the highest level that he wants to get in his life, to achieve as much as he possibly can, if he didn't have some kind of immutable struggle, like growing up poor, black, or female, or transgendered, or homosexual, then he really hasn't earned his achievements.
That is the majority of a lot of communities, how a lot of communities feel.
I think what you mean is that's how the majority of a lot of communities or individuals within those communities who achieve feel. Like if you work really hard in this country, if you do everything that you possibly can to put yourself in the position to achieve and to earn and to get what's yours, then you can make it and then you think it was worth it. But the problem is you have a certain criteria of things that one has to go through in order to be labeled a success or a success story, some kind of hero of the masses, some kind of hero of the people. And if you haven't gone through this kind of social justice progressive roadmap that pits you against some kind of invisible oppressive force, then your achievement isn't real. It's not really yours.
And it's because if you haven't had a transition in your life where, you were maybe born poor or born without, certain privileges, and then especially as you transition into having certain privileges in your life, you actually see and feel and sense and taste and smell all of the differences. If you've never experienced different treatment in your life, you wouldn't know what different treatment feels like or looks like.
This is kind of that mindless millennial twaddling that I was telling you guys about. But this is interesting, and this is why I think that AOC herself, despite the fact that she says that you kind of have this epiphany when you realize that you're privileged, you have this epiphany that, oh my gosh, you can actually see when you are privileged. And I think the irony of this is she lacks introspection to such a high degree. Like, she doesn't understand that people like her, like people like me, we don't have to go through the same struggles of poverty that our parents went through. Like, she doesn't have to go through the same racial struggles that her parents went through in order to be a success, or in order to view herself as a successful person who's achieved a great deal in life. All she has to do is work hard and see the fruits of her labor. Like, that's it. You don't have to experience the same things as the people who came before you. You don't have to experience the same struggles. And Milton Friedman actually talked about this when he talked about the way that parents save money, how it's incredibly irrational. He talked about how these are people who have every reason to believe that their children are going to have it off better than they are, and yet they scrimp and save to give it to their children. And it's the same thing with their rearing, like with the way that they grew up and the way that they were raised. Parents don't want their children to endure that kind of struggle. And this is kind of the existential crisis of the millennial generation. Like, they feel like there is some kind of struggle that they have to overcome, something that has to test their resilience as people in order for them to be deemed by our society as valuable or as worthy of being a U.S. citizen or just being a person in general. And it's just a really sad mindset to have.
If you've never experienced different treatment in your life, you wouldn't know what different treatment feels like or looks like.
And again, that's such a short-sighted way to look at the world, and it really does a disservice to a lot of people. I mean, I've traveled all over the world. I've been treated considerably worse by citizens of other countries because I wasn't of their race, or I wasn't of their ethnicity, or just because simply I was a foreigner or I was an American. I mean, it's incredibly short-sighted to think that just because you look different or you were born different, that you can't achieve, and that you'll never understand what it's like to experience discrimination.
And it's really, really hard. I mean, it's like, and we can all, almost every single person in this country can acknowledge some privilege of some type,
Right. This is so autistically Orwellian. This is the all Americans are privileged, some Americans are more privileged than others. I mean, Thomas Sowell's been talking about this for years, how American people, like poor people in the United States, have it off so much better than poor people in other countries. And it just goes to show that if you live in the United States, like if you're a citizen or if you're a legal resident of the United States, then your odds are already better off than 96% of the rest of the global population.
I'm a cisgendered woman. I will never know the trauma of feeling like I'm not born in the right body. Mm-hmm. And that is a privilege that I have, mm-hmm. no matter how poor my family was when I was born.
Alex, are you saying that Caitlyn Jenner has it off worse than some poor bum living on the streets of Chino? Is that what you're saying? Are you saying that Zoe Tour has it off worse than some poor homeless man living on the streets of Anacostia, Maryland, like right across the river from where you live? Like right across from the Navy Yard. You live in some expensive, like wealthy, upper class apartment complex, and you, a woman of color, probably had it off worse than some white bum growing up, again, living across the river, like living under the bridge over there in the Beltway. Is that what you're saying to me right now? See, this is why you are so fucking divorced from reality. This is why I have a problem with socialists. You and especially millennial socialists. You guys have absolutely no perspective on anything. Like, this is you being foolish, Alex. This is your ideology getting the best of you and having zero fucking empathy for anybody who's simply just a white male who's poor. Like, you think that people like Caitlyn Jenner have it off worse than that poor bum growing up or just living underneath the bridge. That's what you think. You actually believe that. Jesus Christ.
But it's really hard for some people to admit that they, it's part of this weird American dream mythology that we have.
Mm-hmm.
That in a lot of circumstances isn't as true or isn't as clearly communicated as we'd like for it to be, or we wish it was.
Alex, a minute ago, you literally said that almost everybody in this country has some form of privilege. And I know what you meant by that. You meant that by virtue of being in the United States, you have an upper hand over people from other countries. But you're right. Some people, by no fault of their own, can just never get themselves out of a rut. We just, as a society, have to ensure that there are as few barriers and stumbling blocks as possible to make sure that everybody has the same equality of opportunity. Because if we start adopting these policies from this ideology that you're espousing, then when you say things like this...
Almost every single person in this country can acknowledge some privilege of some type,
Right. Then we won't have an upper class, we won't have a middle class, we won't have a lower class, we won't even have a wealthy class. We will have an inner party of bureaucrats, and everybody else will be poor.